So my name is Tom Jordan. I do technical architecture and things like that in kind of the interoperability and identity and access management space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, as we start to look forward, as to what a future interoperability environment might look like. I'm going to talk a little bit about set design to go back to our theater metaphor, and talk a little bit about what the stage that we're hoping to set might look like in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about three really, fairly broad technical areas of focus that we've talked a lot about in this space. I'm going to introduce what we're calling a lo-fi or low fidelity interoperability architecture. There's a lot of details left to be worked out, but you can see kind of the general sense of where our discussion has gone. We'll go through some process walkthroughs that talk about how different actors might interact with the set on stage, and then give a quick summary and talk a little bit about where we see as some of the essential starting points for actually building that set. So three areas of focus are really around this idea of data, identity, and integration. First off, with regards to data interoperability, there's a big question about how we express or consume data in an institutionally manageable and institutionally meaningful way. Our history is a lot around the idea of direct system integration. We get information out of a PeopleSoft system in PeopleSoft vernacular, and we're very wedded to that vendor's terminology about the data that's within it. And that certainly, we kind of start to meld our business processes around a particular vendor's implementation of a product and our data processes around the vendor's interpretation of that data. In identity and access management, we really drive a lot of those things based on data events that may be significant to a particular line of business system, as opposed to stepping back and looking at the business level event that really, signifies somebody changing status in our community or things like that, that should cascade a set of access control changes. And then in the integration services, what we're really looking to do is to really set the stage for a more standardized, standards-based, uniform approach to how we accomplish integrations within applications. And go to the next one. So the next slide is really kind of a lo-fi interoperability architecture, and there are handouts of this available as well. So hopefully you can see in a little bit more detail. What we've got on the left-hand side of this diagram is really a series of line of business systems, things like our student system, our employee system, our curricular and financial systems, and things like that. They're services and systems that are on campus to achieve a particular line of business function. We may have vendor implementations of those things, we may have custom implementations of those things, but they're really focused generally on a singular purpose or a singular set of purposes serving an individual office. Our integration practice historically has been very much around providing direct integrations to those systems when we need to get data in and out of those things. And that's created some issues for us, right? Each one of those systems ends up with kind of a spider web of dependencies to other systems that all need to be considered when it comes time to upgrade or patch or make system changes. When that line of business system owner sees that their colleagues at another institution are doing something really effective by making a change to that system or migrating to a different platform, they then have to consider all of those integration points before they can make a change. So this spider web of integrations is fragile. It depends very heavily on vended definitions of software attributes and systems, and it has the effect of really doing a lot to kill agility at the line of business level, because every one of those system owners has to consider the whole universe before they're able to make a change. So in the model that we're looking at, the stage that we're trying to set, we try to get away from that spider web of integration model and get more to the idea of hub and spoke as our integration methodology. So we introduced this idea of something like a master data or data aggregation hub that allows us to be able to pull data from and potentially project data into line of business systems and get them into a more vendor neutral, more business focused definition of what we're calling enterprise business objects or core business objects that represent entities in our environment that are common integration points. Things like a student, a job, a course, a department. in vendor neutral terms so that we can be able to express those to downstream systems as a as an integration point. Riding on top of that, of course, is an important aspect of our campus data governance process, where we actually get to the point where we describe data institutionally. Current student, what does it mean to have a current term? What does a course mean? What things like that. To be able to curate those things over time, because definitions change, use of data changes, and we need to be able to understand what is today's standard, who's still using yesterday's standard, and who's working on tomorrow's standard. Then figuring out, how do we actually reach a point where we say this definition is institutionally blessed, and this is the one that we're going to start using going forward. From there, we need to provide people a way to be able to access that. And an effective integration platform is a really important piece of that. Along the right-hand side, things like discovery, request, API, event, and data are all different characteristics around how we envision that actors would interact with the set. How do I discover, for example, what data is available? How do I request access to it? API is a really important strategy that we see in the future to be able to get away from the idea of integration patterns that we've seen in the past that are often focused on really bulk ETL types of operations, extract data, transform them, load them somewhere else, which often introduces lots of synchronization issues and latency issues that really take us away from the idea of real-time service delivery that a lot of us are trying to get to. So providing a more rich integration environment that provides something like, a person API or a course API that allows people to gather this data in real time, and also provide an event stream that lets us see, that an important event happened about a person. Do we have a way to communicate that to the community in which, in a way that software can hook into that automatically and do what it needs to do based on that event? Whether that's a student enrolling, an employee being hired, things like that. And then having uniform ways to be able to present data so that when we do have to do things like extract, transform, load, one of the great lessons of the cloud is that apparently in some cases with cloud vendors, we're back to doing flat file imports, right? Because that's a methodology that they present, and we have to be presenting an integration toolkit that's rich enough to satisfy the vendors that we have to work with, right? But we do have opportunities within that to be able to automate and mechanize and standardize the things that are currently, very ad hoc and singular processes to be able to be more responsive to integration needs when they come up. At the bottom is really this sense of an identity and access management platform that allows us to take the two things that are up above it and actually stitch that into controlling access to services. So for example, when we do have that event or that data change, we can drive access based on role to be able to grant people access to services. Two important things that we've talked about in that space are this idea of having a sense of what our roles are on campus. We have a common definition for things like current student or current employee or things like that. When we get down into a little bit more detail, we get to have a notion about the idea that we can ask what should current students get access to? When they stop being current students, how should their accesses change? When a student transitions to an employee, how should their service access or their data access change? So we get into this idea of being able to have a more natural language type of conversation about authorizations, about, I can understand what our institutional roles are. There may be roles that aren't at the institutional level, but are still more important, or that are still important for discussion about access. The role may be member of the middleware team, member of the integration team, and that may drive access to systems. An important point of a lot of what we've been talking about is around this idea of trying to be able to be more user-focused than system-focused in the way that we present access to services. That helps us when we get into enterprise business objects and the idea of standard data outside of individual system silos. but it also really helps us when we start to look at how we interact with users. So one of the important parts of the stage that we're trying to set is around this idea of user-focused identity. And the ability for a user to have some stake in the ownership of their data, some stake in the ownership of their interaction with the university. We've heard as feedback a lot about how, it's difficult to get a net ID, and when I get it, I don't know what I do with it. If I'm in a population that doesn't use it regularly, I don't remember what it is or where I use it versus the thing that I actually use every day. And so there's a very much a sense around the idea of being able to manage identity and login as maybe not exactly the same thing. So if I'm significant to UW-Madison in some way, I may be able to maintain a profile about myself where I express my personalization information, my preference information. Maybe I have some control over my privacy and where my data goes and things like that. I might even have the ability to express things of interest about me. I'm studying this, but I'm also interested in this, and I'm looking for the confluence of these two things. But I can express that information and manage it on my own. I can also have some semblance of being able to choose an amount of data and a login mechanism that's appropriate to the, kind of the closeness of my relationship with the institution. If I'm taking a non-credit course in, some personal enrichment thing, maybe I don't need to go through a full-blown net ID creation and supply all sorts of sensitive information about myself that just feels kind of icky and inappropriate based on the very lightweight transaction that I'm having with the institution. Maybe I've got a path to be able to use my Facebook account and supply my credit card, and then take my non-credit music class or something like that, right? But then when my relationship deepens, and we may have the opportunity to help to deepen that relationship based on the interest data that was supplied, then maybe a more intimate relationship starts to become more appropriate. And we can start to look based on security and risk and requirement and things like that, that now that I've actually joined the organization, I've become an employee and I have access to some of the most sensitive data that the university carries, then maybe we need to up our game a little bit in terms of the authentication methods that are used. Maybe I need multi-factor, maybe I need more rigorous approval to the systems that I have access to, and things like that. But we're able to drive that more effectively based on the individual and the context of the individual and what they're trying to access. Making sense so far? Okay. What I'd like to, the next slide talks a little bit about this vision of being able to flow data from multiple data sets into the idea of a common representation of a person and the things that happen to a person. So we have things like, we may use the terms of data slices or data domains as a way to talk a little bit about having separate domains kind of aggregate, with the idea of student data, employee data, affiliate data, profile data, all flowing through this data aggregation and integration platform and through identity and access management to be able to provide a uniform view of a person and the roles that they have. Maybe the applicant, student, instructor, and advisor role belong to the student domain. They contribute that slice to a master person record. Employee and contractor might come from the HR system, and that data slice may be contributed that way. But we can see too that there may be streams of events that can happen that all come back to a person contributed from different data domains. An applicant being admitted or a student being enrolled may be things that we could trigger access changes based on, or an employee being hired or contract engagement starting or ending, are all things that you could use to drive an event architecture that manipulates access control, but could also trigger significant business processes as well, right? We don't need to limit this to the security or integration space. We can also drive business processes based on these things. And a uniform API structure gives us a way to be able to present a single image of a person with different slices of that person belonging to different data domains. And when we start to bring in the profile, we start to enhance that idea that one of the data custodians on campus might actually be the individual, to be able to express that individualization information, that personalization information that folks are really familiar with in every other aspect of their lives, because every other service provider that they're interacting with, or many of the other service providers they're interacting with, actually give them the opportunity to be able to maintain that information about themselves and maybe express some level of control about what happens with that information.